And this is the thing with the RNGs. If you're gonna roll dice or balance certain bluffing frequencies in certain scenarios, you might fall into the trap that you start randomizing with a hand that's never a bluff. Okay, that's one. Or you start randomizing a hand that's always a bluff. Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm here today for you guys with another video where we are going to look at bluffing. But before we get into the good stuff, remember that if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Also subscribe to the channel as we will be releasing more content in the future. Without further ado, let's get into the example. Today we are dealt ace-5 suited, great hand. In the small blind, we decided to raise it up and c-bet the flop. Turn was a queen, we decided to check and villain checked behind, and on the river falls a 9 and it's up to us with ace-5. And the question is, do we bluff or don't we bluff? As always, I will consult SOLVER for this question. What does he consult us to do? He will say that ace-5 is usually a check, sometimes a bet. In this case, the betting will probably come mainly from the ace-5 of diamonds, because the ace-5 of diamonds is unblocking hands that villain will float the flop with and fold the river. Mainly hands like ace-deuce of spades, ace-3 of hearts, ace-4 of clubs, etc. So basically, if we have ace-5 of diamonds, villain's fold equity will be a little bit higher than if he would have ace-5 of spades. And in theory, you know, a 1% more folds can make the difference between a bluff being plus EV or a bluff being minus EV. Remember, it's a solver, everything is quite close. So to bluff or not to bluff, what to take in consideration? Well, as I just mentioned, blockers, are we blocking villain's calling range or folding range? If we look at ace-5 here, we are blocking, well, maybe king-5 offsuit if villain had that, could check back the turn, call the river. Ace-7, ace-6, if those hands you think will call, we are indeed blocking some calls. But like I said, mainly we are blocking some, I would say, we are blocking hands that are sort of automatically folding the river, like ace-8, ace-10, ace-5, etc, etc. So I wouldn't necessarily say ace-5 is a great hand blocker-wise to bluff with. Range advantage, the stronger our range, the more and bigger we can bet. This is also a general principle which you should take in consideration if you are deciding to bluff. In this case, do we have a range advantage? Think so. We could still be checking strong on the turn. I don't think it's very likely our opponent will check back strong hands on the turn in position himself. In general, when you're out of position, you're more inclined to check strong hands because there's still a chance villain will bet, then we can raise. Whereas if you're in position here on the turn, if you check behind with a strong hand, you have missed the opportunity to get 2 streets of value. So I don't think villain has a lot of strong hands here. And we can still check strong hands on the turn. I think the 9, we can improve to pocket 9s, which I think he will 3-bet. We can have queen 9, he can have queen 9, we can have king 9, he can have king 9, 7, 9. Yeah, for the rest is quite evenly divided. So from that point of view, yes, we should bet. What does my RNG say, aka how high did I roll? For the guys who don't know what an RNG is, basically it's a random number generator, and it's a concept, I think it was popularized on the training site Run It Once, and then mainly by Ben Salsky. Basically, you know, you're just mixing up your frequencies like a solver. However, do remember this is usually just an attempt to play balanced, as it's very hard in game to know what kind of frequency a solver will make a certain play. How high did I roll kind of comes from the dice, like, okay, a number from 1 to 6, then 6 is the most aggressive action and 1 is the most passive action. Does my story check out? Question mark. How much potential bluffs do I have? What are you representing? Basically, I'm usually a big fan of seeing poker or playing a poker hand as a story. You're trying to tell a story that will make sense for your opponent. So in this case, if my opponent has a 7, I want to tell a story that I have better than a 7. So I will take a line and use a certain sizing. In this case, maybe for example, a small sizing, so I could be representing a 9, which is very bad for a hand like a 7. But these are all nice points to consider, but actually I wanted to focus a little bit more on the last point, given the trend or topic of this video. Are all these points above relevant given the tendencies of human beings, in this case population, and or my current opponent. So if we take a look at the same example and we take a look at what villain is supposed to do in theory, if we bet at 3/4, bad villain is supposed to fold 46% of the time, and here we can kind of see the hands that villain should be playing this way. In this case blue is fold, and usually when you start analyzing a river spot in a solver, it's always a good idea to take a look at, okay, which kind of hands is villain bluffing with, which kind of hands is villain folding, and then using your brain and common sense and knowledge and experience as a poker player to figure out if you think this is relevant. So do you think it is, do you think it makes sense that villain will always call you with pocket deuces on the river? I personally don't think so. I think that hand is most likely folding. And again, here you will see the blockers in play. Yeah, fives is an absolute stronger hand than pocket deuces, but apparently if they're both bluff catchers and if we have deuces, villain will have, for example, like a hand like ace five that he can bluff with. So you would prefer to call with a hand like pocket deuces because it's not blocking any bluffs. Okay. But given the topic of this chapter, population versus the solver, what does the population do? If we take a look at a blind versus blind example and we take a look at a high-low-low board, we can see that the fold versus bet check bet 3/4 is around 55% and they raise around 9.6%. Whereas if we then compare what does population do compared to solver, and basically you always have to make this comparison to see if a solver output is relevant, or at least like if the population would fold exactly 46% and raise exactly 13.0.2%, we should always follow the solver. It's very relevant. However, as soon as your opponent or your population starts to deviate, the highest EV play would be to adjust and exploit your opponent. So the question now is, should we RNG or roll a dice with ace-5 suited? Should we balance our bluffing frequencies with a hand like ace-5 suited, or should we take the fact that we have a poor blocker very high in our list of considerations? That's my question to you. Do you? If you said no, okay, or came up with a whole bunch of yes buts, think about them for a second and analyze its relevance. So should we RNG or roll a dice here? If you said yes, but blah blah blah, I want you to kind of write down the buts now for a moment and think about them and see how relevant they are. If you said something like yes, but then I'll be over bluffing, this is something that I hear quite often when I say, okay, I think ace-5 suited here should be a bluff, and then I usually ask them, is that really a problem if someone is over folding? Think about this for a second. Do you want to play balanced, or spoiler, do you want to make an attempt of playing balanced GTO, or do you want to play a strategy that in a vacuum is highest EV, a maximizing strategy? I would say that if someone is over folding, we should be over bluffing. That's kind of the whole nature of how you can generate higher EV in poker. So save yourself the overthinking and start with the last question first. Like I said, yes, it indeed had poor blockers. We were maybe blocking, we were not really blocking hands that would call, we were blocking some hands that would fold. But in the end, how big is the gap that we're playing with? You saw the gap between what population is doing and what the solver is doing was quite big. So a blocker is not gonna be the difference between our bluff being plus EV or minus EV. In the end, guys, it's as simple as this. Folders are going to fold and callers are going to call. So if you have a guy who's a happy caller, he's most probably over calling. If you have a guy who's a happy folder, he's most probably over folding. So if you would say that this is the response of our opponent, which as we saw in the data is more likely, I don't think pocket deuces will call. I think all these low pocket pairs will probably just fold. I think a hand like ace-6 suited will probably also fold. Basically, I made him fold most of the 6x and some 7x. I started to make him hero call. And it's up to you to ask yourself versus the opponent that you're playing or versus the population that you're playing, how you think folding frequencies will look like. And just look at the hands and intuitively, also for yourself, would you call here with pocket deuces? Yeah, I wouldn't call here with pocket deuces. So for the for the next time someone is in this situation, exploit me, I won't call you with pocket deuces, I'll promise you. And here we will see the correct adjustment, so the maximizing strategy versus a response as shown here on the left, which was equivalent to what population is most likely doing. And now we can see that ace-5 suited has become a pure bluff. Okay, there's now a flipping point. Yes, ace-5 of diamonds is probably still the highest EV bluff. However, not bluffing with ace-5 of spades right now is less plus EV than bluffing. Okay, so therefore we bluff. And now I can already hear a couple of you guys, what about balance? Okay, what about balance? Balance can't be reached in game, okay? There's only an attempt to play correctly, and this is the thing with the RNGs. If you're gonna roll dice or balance certain bluffing frequencies in certain scenarios, you might fall into the trap that you start randomizing with a hand that's never a bluff, okay, that's one, or you start randomizing a hand that's always a bluff, okay? We cannot understand poker completely. Our opponent can never defend GTO in this situation, okay? He will not on the fly see exactly how his range looks. He will always be off by a couple of percent, and a solver output, a couple of percent, will usually lean the strategy towards extreme left or right, as we saw in the previous video. If you haven't checked that one out, in the bluff catching video, where we went from a balanced calling range on the river to a 0% folding range. And if you start playing around with solver and adding in some scenarios that are way more likely in practice, you will see this occurring more often. And the last point I wanted to look at, to list in considerations, does villain show up with the hands that fold on the river? And what I mean with that is, let's say villain indeed was folding deuces to fives. Let's say villain already folds his hand on the flop, then obviously we should maybe adjust our bluffing frequencies on the river, because he will basically have way less hands that are going to fold. Okay, this is a general concept. If you start bluffing certain hands, if you want to bluff certain hands on the river, do make sure villain actually showed up to the river with those hands. So, main takeaway for you guys for this bluffing video. I want you guys to prevent overthinking and start with what is most relevant. If you play 100 NL, 50 NL, etc., please don't start RNGing and try to balance your ranges. And in my sentence, you can already hear this. I say try to balance your ranges. It's impossible to do and a waste of time. Point number 2, you should think less, and this is kind of a recurring one from the previous video from bluff catching as well. Thinking less about how your range should play on theory on the river. It's obviously good to have a theoretical understanding of how the spot should be played, mainly because then if in this case we are in the big blind and we know that ace-5 suited shouldn't be bluffing, and if we see someone bluffing, we know that it's likely that he is over bluffing. Okay, it's always, and I've said this in the previous video as well, it's never an excuse to not use a solver, because in order to exploit someone correctly, we first need to know what is right. Okay, so definitely important to know what is theoretically correct in a spot like that. And then from there we can see if population, if you think your current opponents are going to approach the spot in the same way. And from there, think more about what your opponent has, try to figure out what the guy has, and then figure out if the guy is willing to fold or not. Okay, so in that example that we gave, you think your opponent is likely to fold a 7 and a 6. If your answer is yes, please always bluff with ace-5. If you think he's never folding those hands and you think he has already folded pocket pairs on the flop, please do not bluff ace-5. Okay. And last but not least, again, things are often not close in practice, so blockers matter less. Again, this is the whole example with the ace-5 of diamonds is probably your best bluff compared to ace-5 of spades. However, the blocker impact in practice is not going to make the difference between something being plus EV or minus EV. It's only going to increase or decrease the EV of that already was with that hand. So I hope you guys liked this video and start to bluff various spots in too high of a frequency, get called, and afterwards send me a lot of angry messages wanting your money back. As always, we cannot be held responsible for you making certain bluffs and your opponent calling with hands that he should not be calling with, so please be careful. These are actually great spots that if you make a bluff and you think someone is folding but he didn't fold a certain hand, probably good to reevaluate that situation if your initial read was right. If you haven't done so, and if you did like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you again didn't like this video, give it a thumbs down. Make sure to subscribe. Here you can see all our social medias, basically all the icons are here. You can follow us and get in touch with us basically anywhere. Good luck bluffing, everyone.